Which show is it? Sit down.
Al kain lo yakuma rishoyin b'mishpat katoyin b'das tzadikim ki yodea Adonai derech tzadikim v'derech rishoyin tovei. Happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the path of sinners, nor sat in the company of the scornful. Rather, that one's delight is in the Torah of God, meditating on Hashem's Torah day and night, and will be like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, whose leaf will not wither, and whatsoever that one does prospers. Not so the wicked, who are like chaff that the wind has driven away. Therefore, the wicked shall not survive judgment, and sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord loves the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is doomed. At this time, I'd like to call upon Rabbi Moskowitz. I'm sorry, Mrs. Rabbi Moskowitz will address us.
Today, my heart is overflowing with gratitude. I feel like I am a very fortunate person. When I was 18, my friend Nancy said to me, "You are going to meet my cousin and marry him." After 3 dates and 8 days, he proposed to me. And I instantly knew that he was my destiny, and I was right. 60 and a half years ago, my dear husband invited me to go on an adventure with him. He said, "My life is enough. So you won't have money, status, or glory, but I promise you that you will never be bored." Together, we had 60 plus amazing years. And since we felt that our lives began when we found each other, 60 plus 60 gave us our May of history. My husband spent his life doing what he loved, sharing with and listening to others' ideas on various topics. This was his natural personality, and therefore he could not understand why such actions were worthy of recognition. He truly did not understand why there were four dinners in our honor. To assist him in recognizing and realizing his accomplishments, I approached the students and they created a thank you book. He enhanced their lives, but he still didn't get it. However, the fact that his beloved students, who he considered his children, have chosen to carry on his teaching and emulate his wisdom, his kindness, and his chesed with future generations. That gave him pleasure and nachas. My husband was in dialysis at the Exceptional Northwest Kidney Center a month short of 4 years. His amazing doctor, Leah Hazley, guided every step of the way and continued to do so even after he began hospice and she was no longer his doctor. Ever from Kippur this year, he suffered the first of this series of heart attacks, followed by another one on Sukkot. He received excellent care at Harborview Hospital and then in rehab at the Klein Gowan. He desperately wanted to come home, and I, of course, wanted that too. But this would not be an easy undertaking. He would not be able to go upstairs, so with the help of wonderful friends, we made our downstairs den into our new living quarters. This room had been the place that he gave all his classes to men, women, students, their parents, and Noachites, and everyone who wanted to join. We think of it as the room where magic happened. And it seems very fitting that in the zechus of what he did in that magic place, the last 8 months of his life was able to be spent happily in that room with love and dignity. The room next door was available to our angels, Mani and Ann, who each worked 12-hour shifts, loving and caring for him as if he was their father. In fact, they called him Papa. And they took care of me too. He would not have been able to continue with dialysis without the equally loving care of his caregivers / drivers / friends, Karen and Dinah. Who did much more than drive. The excellent care that he received would not have been possible without the financial assistance of beloved Talmidim and dear friends. Throughout this time, we were lovingly supported by the cooking, the calling, and the visiting of our unparalleled community. And my BFF, Rabbi Che, and his BFF, Rabbi Che, were with us both every minute of our journey. Regular Shabbos visits from Rabbi Bernie and Shirley Fox, Ben Aronson, and our beloved Lishmanda, who is not here today because she has COVID, and my dear friend Michelle Benisty, is something he looked forward to every week. To have had at home for the last 8 months is the greatest gift I could ever have received. And for everyone who made this happen, I will be eternally grateful. Without the support of Dr. Wayne and Providence Hospice, this could not have been achieved. I am grateful to all of you, but most of all to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for bringing this extraordinary man into my life. I know I was never there. To my non-biological daughter, Rachel, there are no adequate words to express my appreciation to you for flying in from Florida and babysitting me forever. My gratitude and thanks to congregations Sephardic Cholim and all the people who put all the pieces together that were lovingly coordinated by our dear non-biological son, Rabbi Bernie Fox. All of you helped to create a fitting tribute for this amazing man who at this moment I am sure is saying, why all of us? Thank you all for being here. It certainly is a very good tribute and very meaningful.
This time, Rabbi Yisrael Chait, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva B'nai Torah, will be addressing us from New York on the video screen.
I would like to add a little to what Leah just mentioned. For 8 months.
Rabbi Chait, wait 1 minute, please. I can. I want to make sure everybody can hear you.
For 8 months, we spoke on the phone together every single day, many times for hours.
Rabbi Chait, we can't hear you yet. Hold on 1 minute, please. I'm sorry. I'll let you know.
Better off on the other computer.
It's not you, it's their receiving audio. We can hear you fine on Zoom.
Okay. For 8
Should he start?
We can hear him.
Okay. Is it okay now? Do you hear me?
I
We
think
can
they're
hear
not
you.
hearing you at the Levaya. The Zoom crowd can hear, Rabbi. It's the crowd that's trying to put a video so others can hear. I think that's the issue. So they're waiting for a
We-
green light.
We can hear. We can hear.
We can hear.
Rabbi Chait, b'chavod.
So for 8 months, Mrs. Moskowitz and my wife and myself met, spoke on the phone every day, many times for hours. And this was because Mrs. Moskowitz had one thing on her mind during the entire 8 months. And that was to make sure that Rabbi Moskowitz got the greatest care possible in every little twist and turn, and to make sure that he was as comfortable and having as good a life as humanly possible under the situation. And she was totally devoted to this task. And she accomplished it with great sacrifice. Let me talk a little bit about Rabbi Moskowitz. We first met in the Chofetz Chaim Yeshiva. I saw him walk, he was on the line for breakfast with a smile on his face, a cigarette dangling out of his mouth. And he was a person that I sensed is a little different than everybody else. Didn't know exactly what it was, but I could sense that difference. The first understanding of the difference was that he was a person that partook of the Simchas L'Chaim that God gave us. And in spite of all circumstances, he always found that element that simplified. But that was just one point. That was the point Chazal say. Chazal say that in the name of Shmuel, I alma kiluladam. This world is like a wedding. Chatof v'achol, chatof v'achol. Grab and eat, and grab and eat. You wouldn't expect Chazal to say something like that, because they were talking about Al Nazar. And Rashi explains that if you're fortunate and you have money to enjoy yourself, don't postpone it, because it's Kiyulula. The time goes very, very quickly, and it's gone. But you see from this Chazal, that Chazal didn't only value Chaye Olam, they also value Chaye Shor. After all, God gave us these things to enjoy. So you would be remiss if you didn't enjoy it. But you have to know how to enjoy it. What Chazal tried to avoid was making a mistake and calling Chaye Shor Chaye Olam. Chaye Shor has its place. Chatov v'achol. And it's necessary for a person in order to have the Simchas Chayim. And that's what I noticed in Rabbi Moskowitz, that he had the Simchas Chayim and he knew how to attain it according to Torah and Halacha and Musar and Hashkafa. And he knew how to obtain this good. When we first met, there was a time that he was teaching in Reading, Pennsylvania. And every week, every Thursday night, he would travel 3 hours from Reading, Pennsylvania to my apartment in Far Rockaway. And we would learn all night long and daven ha'etz, and he would travel back to 3 hours to Reading, Pennsylvania. That was his Avas HaTorah. And another date, he was teaching in Waterbury, Connecticut. And I would go there occasionally for Shabbos. But he made me a tremendous offer. He said, if you want to move in, I'll take care of you. I'll take care of your support, and we'll just learn at nighttime. Although I didn't take him up on that offer, I appreciated the generosity that he expressed, both from his part and from his wife's part, because it wasn't a gigantic apartment, and I would naturally be infringing on some of their privacy. But they both were happy to make that offer. I would say he was very much a Sameach L'Chava. But there's one more important thing that I feel we have to clinch here. And that is something that the Talmudim saw too. And that is that you could sense in Rabbi Moskowitz that he did not care for pretense or for convention. And if you had shown good reason, according to Torah, why he should do something, he would turn on a dime. Like when he left his family to go to Seattle because he felt there was a better opportunity for Abbas' Torah. So for a year's time, he lived away from his wife and child, except for occasional visits. And he learned and taught in Seattle. You could sense that, that ability to turn on a dime. All he needed was the correct reasoning to warrant such a move. But I dare say there are very few people that have that ability. And that's why I believe that's one of the main reasons that his personality was so attractive. He taught hundreds of students, and I dare say nobody that went through his classes forgot him. He made a permanent change in the way of thinking of the student. I met a student that became successful in business. I asked him, how did you become so successful? He said, I had Rabbi Moskowitz. So Rabbi Moskowitz taught them how to think out of the box. And he reached them with his life as a model. He would teach many hours after school for no remuneration. The only reward he had was the smile that was on his face when he finished giving his class. Chazal say that Yoav ben Tzuriah was buried in the Midbar. So you might ask, can you imagine Yoav ben Tzuriah, the captain of David HaMelech's army, should be buried in a desert? So the Gemara says, it's not Beiso Bamidbar, it's Beiso Kamidbar, which means that his home was like a public domain. Anybody could walk in, anybody could take anything. He did not have that haughty sense of possession. He didn't feel that he really possessed anything. So really what Chazal is saying is that it's Beiso Bamidbar and Beiso Kamidbar. His house was like Hefker for everybody, but also he lived in the Midbar because he wanted to be reminded of the fact that our human concept of possession is just an illusion. Like we say in Tfilas Nila, that we should cease from feeling that what we possess is what our value is. And that Rabbi Moskowitz was a great teacher. So I think these elements played a big role in causing him to be such a great influence. The Gemara says that when the person makes himself like a midbar, so then he gets matana. Midbar matana. Matana is a gift from God. What's the gift? The gift is Torah. Rabbi Moskowitz had a very special gift. God gave him something very special. He gave him insight into Mishnah, which he loved very much. And he gave him the ability to comprehend Mishnah and to teach it to others. And then the end of the passage, once he gets the Torah that God gave him with Matana, he's no chalkel. Hashem v'nachalasa. And that is the highest level attainable to a human being. And Rabbi Moskowitz reached that level himself and with others. And therefore I say, Tehenish Mosel, Suragos, Utsurachaim, Adoshem Nachlas. You know, Shalom, Shkava, Amen.
We are gathered to give the kavod acharon to a Adam Gadol. We give the final honor to a very great man. As I look around this sanctuary, I contemplate how many of our lives were changed or influenced by our relationships with Rabbi Moskowitz. And as I share with you aspects of my story, I invite you to consider yours and his impact. Ashrei ish asher lo halach ba'atzas v'shamim u'b'derech hata'im lo amad u'b'moshav leiksim lo yashav. Happy is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in the dwelling of mockers. This beautiful pasuk opens Sefer Tehillim. It is also the first pasuk I studied with Rabbi Moskowitz. That day, we both started high school at Hillel Academy in Pittsburgh. I was a freshman and he was the school's newest Rebbe.
The encounter altered my life's direction. I think that before we met, I was committed to conventional, modern, Orthodox values. I might have gone on to attend Yeshiva University on my way to a professional or business career. Maybe as an adult, I would have attended the Chevra Shas or some other class once a week. But Torah would have been an aspect of my life and not its focus. How did Rabbi Moskowitz persuade me to reconsider? Well, first, he immediately grabbed my attention. He did not look or act like any previous Rebbe. He wore a plaid jacket, sported a trimmed goatee, and smoked a pipe. But more unusual than his appearance was his message. We were used to being told that we should keep mitzvah. We had a vague understanding of some sort of reward, but basically we thought of observance as a sort of sacrifice Hashem expects of us. Rabbi Moskowitz taught us that first pasuk. Happy is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in the dwelling of mockers. His focus was on the word ashrei, happy. He explained that the Torah is not asking for our sacrifice. It is providing a path to happiness and fulfillment. He did not try to evoke our guilt, sense of obligation, or try to convince us that about some sort of reward. He appealed to our self-interest. He showed us how Torah is a guide for achieving happiness and meaning in our lives. And as we listened, at first reluctantly and with skepticism, we fought him. After all, what healthy teenager easily accepts the proposition that living by a set of rules and statutes promotes happiness? The rabbi loved the debate and eagerly provoked our questions. And with time, he wore us down with countless examples of the Torah's insights and wisdom. My life and many others were changed and inspired by this sort of encounter with a master teacher. But who was Rabbi Moskowitz? Well, he was an active member of our community for 4 decades, but not everyone knew or understood who he was. His students and those who discussed Torah with him understood, but a more casual observer might be misled. This is because he was completely without pretension. He was the most comfortable in sweatpants and sneakers. He was completely satisfied with a base model compact car. His home was comfortable and decorated with items that were cute, meaningful, or sentimental, but nothing showy. This absence of pretension reflected the depth of his humility. I had a complex relationship with Rabbi. He was my Rebbe. As years passed, we became colleagues. Then I was the head of school, and he was a member of our faculty and administration. I had to balance my responsibilities as head with my debt to my Rebbe and my absolute obligation to respect and honor him. Sometimes I failed, sometimes miserably, but as I struggled, Rabbi Moskowitz seemed oblivious to the shifts in our relationship. Once he asked me if I could propose a solution to some question he had been working on. I listened and I told him, I have no idea. He responded, hey, I invested in you. I expect you to answer the questions I can't. I think many teachers fear being surpassed by their students. Rabbi Moskowitz expected his students to build on the foundations he provided and to advance the vistas that he had not climbed. Sometimes, at least in my instance, I feel that his deep desire for student success led him to see in me more than is there. His students were not misled by his simple Brooklyn accented English, his informal dress, his casual management in his classroom. They understood that Rabbi's humility was based on the most central element of his being, his relationship with Torah and all wisdom. They perceived that he had no truck with pretentious ways because he lived in the world of Chokhmah, wisdom. He was the happy, contented man described by David HaMelech, by King David, in that first passage of Tehillim. His relationship to Torah and wisdom is embodied by a comment attributed to Rabbi Baruch Ber Leibowitz of Kamenetz. He was describing the relationship of the student of Talmud to his studies. He explained that the student is not driven by a chukah, by a passion for study. He explained that the pursuit of understanding is his very nature. It defines him. It is who he is. Study, learning are reflexive and involuntary. Those who were blessed to study with him and know him recognized how perfectly Rabbi Baruch Ber's comments describe Rabbi Moskowitz. He was not moved only by passion for Torah. Torah was who he was. It was as natural to him as our breathing. We don't think about breathing. We don't try. It's an involuntary, reflexive activity. Study and teaching Torah were Rabbi Moskowitz's breath. Again, I invite you to consider how Rabbi Moskowitz impacted your lives in our community. We were blessed to have him. Rabbi Moskowitz's connection to the material world was not very deep. He lived in the world of Torah and Chokhmah. His passing is not for him a significant transition. He is only more fully entering the world he believed is most real. The loss here is ours. We say farewell to a unique and inspirational teacher, to a remarkable role model with the deepest appreciation and gratitude. Over the past months, Shirley and I were permitted to observe the devotion that Rabbi and Mrs. Moskowitz shared. Mrs. Moskowitz was at Rabbi's side day and night. She was his constant companion. She managed his care. She provided for his every need. And Rabbi Moskowitz responded with his appreciation and warmth. Shirley and I learned from Rabbi and Mrs. Moskowitz the meaning of mutual devotion and observed its remarkable depth. Thank you for your attention. Jehei Nishmasot Tzvura B'Tzvura.
At this time, we'll have Rabbi Ben Aronson, Rebbe at Seattle Hebrew Academy, and a student of Rabbi Moskowitz for over 20 years of lessons.
Reshut Rabbanim, permission from Rebbe Fox, other mentors, teachers, colleagues present. For me, it all started with 4 words. The 4 words were, I'll take a question. I was in a freshman Chumash class at the Northwest Yeshiva High School, where Rabbi Moskowitz was the Rosh Yeshiva. What did he mean exactly by, I'll take a question? A question on the pasuk we were learning, a question on anything in Torah or Judaism. It turned out this open invitation included anything related to living life. We could ask about the evidence for the existence of God, the veracity of the Masorah tradition we received from Moshe, or about anger, competition, revenge. If it had to do with living life, the question was fair game. He didn't pretend to have every answer. Sometimes he would quote Rashi and say, I don't know. But what was abundantly clear is that he took your question seriously. It didn't matter if you were a freshman or a senior. If you were curious about life and how to live it, he was your guide. And more than that, you were part of the club. Rabbeinu Yonah defined the club in his commentary on Mishlei, on the pasuk, Ozen shoma tochachat chaim bekereb chachamim talim. An ear that listens to feedback from life is welcome among the wise. We were just teenagers, but he didn't dismiss us. My problems, my emotional world were real to him. Now that didn't mean my emotional world was an accurate reflection of reality, but that was something to straighten out later. He was there for us. The Torah of Rabbi Moskowitz was always applied Torah. It was not some ivory tower academic pursuit. There was no place for intellectual games. It was always about clarity, so clear that it would naturally sink in over time. His Torah was about how the Torah's worldview impacts everyday life. Some might call it Musar or Musar, but it was of a much older type, going back to King Solomon. Mishlei Shlomo ben David Melech Yisrael, the Proverb of Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel. Ladat chokmah musar, lahavin imrei bina, to know wisdom and musar, to understand words of discernment. Lakachat musar haskel, tzedek mishpat umesharim, to take hold of the discipline of wisdom, righteousness, justice, and uprightness. That was one of the first psukim I remember learning with him, Lakachat musar haskel. It was one thing to know something. It was something else entirely to put an idea into practice. Learning with him lived in the space between. He emphasized change was possible, but it took time, effort, and commitment. He joked he was not the same person Mrs. Moskowitz married. She would joke back that it kept things interesting. We spent a lot of time in their home, and together they lived Torah and put it into practice. I know I'm supposed to focus on Rabbi, but I also can't help but comment what I witnessed the last few years in their home. The devotion, skill, love, and support Mrs. Moskowitz showed Rabbi during these trying times. I can't describe it in my own words. I'll borrow a few. A woman of valor who can find, for she is more precious than pearls. Her husband trusts her with his heart and lacks nothing as a result. When he was briefly at Klein Gallon, whenever I saw him, he would ask when Mrs. Moskowitz was coming. What she pulled off to get him home and comfortable was nothing short of incredible. She created an entirely new home for him downstairs. Home for him was clearly wherever she was. He spent his last days in his old Beit Midrash in the best situation possible. Rabbi Moskowitz impacted generations. As a synagogue rabbi and teacher in Pittsburgh, a Rebbe Yeshiva B'nai Torah, and Northwest Yeshiva High School, of course, but also other settings like Sephardic Adventure Camp, where I believe he has an honorary PhD certificate awarded to him at some point during that time. He tirelessly supported the community, and they reciprocated. When he began dialysis, the community responded, offering him rides to and from the kidney center.
I'm not watching, might as well turn it
Former
off.
students across generations loved the opportunity to reconnect with him. I can't speak for everyone, but Rabbi Schneeweiss and I represent a particular generation of Rabbi Moskowitz students among many others that are here. What I remember most fondly were NYHS Shabbatones, sitting around a table talking about the nature and danger of extremism in both thinking and action. Authentic and sustainable change was always slow. My sophomore year, he offered an after-school Mishlei class. High school students actually stayed after class to learn with him. I remember a few students driving home with them, listening to the oldies station here in Seattle, 97.3. Him analyzing each song as it came on. There were a few classic breakup songs where it was clear one party had moved on while the other party psychologically had not yet. Then the Beach Boys came on and she'll have fun, fun, fun till her daddy takes the keyboard away. That one was easy. Enjoying the short term, this person just couldn't see the consequences of their actions. We mostly discussed Torah, but with him, Torah opened up to the entire world. Sundays, we gathered Rabbi Moskowitz's personal Beit Midrash. It is said that over the door of Plato's Academy, it was engraved, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." At Rabbi Moskowitz's door, you just had to know how the knob worked. If you momentarily forgot or tarried for even a minute, you would surely hear a deep but warm voice from inside yell, "Upside down." That was his way of welcoming everyone. On a given morning, you would find physicians, teachers, a mechanic, high school and college students. They were regulars during that time, which varied, by the decade, of course, but generations of Weisses and Schneeweisses and Sinclairs and Russes. Even got to know Jameson's great-grandmother, who was there regularly into her 90s. The generation gap didn't matter in this space. What do we all have in common? We were all human beings trying to make sense of ourselves and the world around us. Our guides were King Solomon and Rabbi Moskowitz. For us, Rabbi Moskowitz was to Torah what Socrates was to philosophy. He was its most honest broker. In a world of fancy speakers, overly eloquent, perhaps entertaining and amusing, Socrates simply asked questions. He guided those around him in the sometimes slow and methodical process, actually beholding an idea, challenging people to articulate a standard and live up to it. Like Socrates, Rabbi Moskowitz pursued Torah and knowledge without any pretension. It didn't matter how much you learned, if you finished the chapter or the book. He took one idea at a time and tried to understand it clearly. He was not impressed by a famous author, a convoluted theory, or a fancy title. You always knew where you stood. He was too honest to hide his reaction. You could rely on him for truthful and straightforward feedback about anything. And he never expected someone to accept his opinion unless they saw it as clearly as he did. I know my friend and colleague, Rabbi Schneeweiss, will talk about our incredible summers together. That was some of the sweetest learning I remember. One of my last conversations with him was about whether classroom learning or more informal learning outside the classroom was more impactful. He wasn't sure, but he surely excelled at both. His example inspired countless educators, of course, but for me, inspired me recently to offer a backyard Pirkei Avot class modeled after his Friday night and Sidash Leishit groups from way back, replete with plentiful snacks. Even without Mrs. Moskowitz's famous popcorn, the connections created over snacks and Torah outside of the strictures of the academic classroom are unique. He loved learning and made this love contagious. We will all miss his humility, intellectual honesty, love of learning, and wisdom. It's hard for me to accept that he's gone. In some ways it can't be. And I'll prove it to you. At an event like this, he would be somewhere towards the back. He would have a subtle look of contentment, thinking about some interesting question or idea. He would greet and welcome anyone who sat down next to him with a gentle and genuine smile, and then quietly ask, so what's new in the world of philosophy? I'd like to conclude with Rabbi Moskowitz in his own words. He wrote a newspaper column with Doug Taylor called Getting It Straight, Practical Ideas for a Life of Clarity, a series of succinct dialogues on varied topics. And in an entry titled Grief, the Rabbi Moskowitz character says the following. When someone experiences a serious loss, there are usually two things that happen. One part of the mind knows that the loss has actually occurred. Yet another part of the mind is unwilling to accept it. In general, grief occurs when one part of you accepts the reality of the loss while another part doesn't. Once you fully accept the reality, grieving stops. In the article, the narrator says, I paused. Finally, I said to him, talking to the Rabbi Moskowitz character, reality is not a very fun place sometimes, is it? No, said the king of rational thought quietly. Sometimes it's not. However, it's the best place to be. Any other place is fantasy. And that will eventually lead to conflict. If your goal is to find real peace, acceptance of reality is the only way. Tehei nishmato survived. Yitzhak Chaim.
This time, Rabbi Matt Schneeweiss, Rebbe and Director of Student Learning Yeshiva and Torah, student of Rabbi Moskowitz for more than 20 years, will address us.
Rabbi Moskowitz was my Rav Mupak, my main Rebbe. Allah defines Rav Mupak as the teacher from whom you learn the majority of your Chachma, your wisdom. Upon the death of Rav Mupak, the Talmud, the student, is obligated to tear their garment in the same way that they would tear for the death of a parent. The source of this law is from a story about Eliyahu Hanavi and his prophetic disciple, Elisha. Upon witnessing Eliyahu's heavenly departure, Elisha cries out, Avi, Avi, Rechav Yisrael Parashav, my father, Israel's chariot and horsemen. After which the verse continues, Elisha grabbed his garments and tore them into two pieces. One of the first ideas I learned from Rabbi Moskowitz was about King Solomon's use of the term son throughout Sefer Mishlei, the book of Proverbs. So Rabbi Moskowitz explained that there are three types of father-son relationships. One is determined by genetics, another by upbringing and parenting. The third is the unique relationship that exists between a teacher and his students. Ralbag explains that just as a biological father produces the physical body of his son, a Rebbe produces the intellect, the soul of his Talmud. It is for this reason that one is obligated to honor one's Rebbe more than one's father. Rambam explains why. Because your father brought you into Olam Hazeh, this world, but your Rav, who taught you Chachma, brings you into Olam Haba, the world to come. How many of us have been brought into Olam Haba by Rabbi Moskowitz? How many of us were introduced to the world of ideas and the beauty of Torah through the clarity of its teachings? How many of us can identify an exact moment in time, whether during a class, a discussion, or a Q&A, which in retrospect marked a crossroads and a turning point in our lives? When I flew back to Seattle yesterday, I had to think about what I would say if my seat partner asked me why I was crying. It dawned on me that the most accurate way to convey my anguish to a stranger who doesn't understand the nature of a Rebbe-Talmud relationship would be to say, my father died. Rabbi Fox acknowledged this fact in the tribute he sent out yesterday, writing that Rabbi Moskowitz is survived by his wife Leah and by hundreds of students who were his children. But Rabbi Moskowitz didn't just bring us into Olam Haba, but also into Olam Hazeh. How? In so many ways. Rabbi Chait mentioned a couple of them, but I have on my own list. By teaching us Mishlei, by showing us how to make decisions with Chachma to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain we experience in this world. by teaching us that if you forego an opportunity to enjoy a permissible and harmless pleasure, then God will hold you accountable for not enjoying the world that He created. By listening patiently to our problems and offering practical advice and psychological counsel to alleviate our suffering and facilitate our happiness. Rabbi Moskowitz showed us that learning can be filled with laughter and jokes. He showed us that there is a time for Torah and there is a time for tiddlywinks. Depending on what area you were from, he may have taken you camping and hiking, taught you how to chop wood and build fires, and maybe even blasted you with a super soaker. Years ago, Doug Taylor wrote a series of articles that Rabbi Aronson mentioned about a fictional character modeled after Rabbi Moskowitz named the King of Rational Thought. When asked how best to live, the king replied, "Just do the right thing and enjoy yourself." Both elements are critical. Why does Elisha refer to his Rebbe as Israel's chariot and its horsemen? Abravanel writes, Eliyahu stood with his nation and fought against the enemies of Israel with more power than a chariot and riders. Those of us who have benefited from Rabbi Moskowitz's wisdom are aware of how many antagonistic forces he has saved us from, both from without and from within. My brother Johnny once expressed to Rabbi Moskowitz a sentiment that many of us have felt. He wrote, "If I imagine never having met you, I honestly don't know where I'd be. There are so many unhealthy lives you prevented me from living." My mom really sums it up the best whenever she talks about the impact Rabbi Moskowitz has had on her life. She says, "Thank God for Rabbi Moskowitz teaching me about reality." Before Eliyahu ascends to the heavens, he asks Elisha, "What can I do for you?" Elisha responds, "Vihi na pi shnayim bruchaha elai." Most commentators translate this as, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." The Abravanel is bothered by this interpretation, commenting, "How could Elisha be so brazen as to ask to be greater than his Rebbe?" Now, Rabbi Fox already addressed this, but Rabbi Moskowitz would not have been bothered by such a request. He took satisfaction in watching his students challenge his ideas. His greatest wish was for his students to become greater than him. He used to say with a smile, "I'm teaching you the methodology of thinking so that one day you'll be able to use them against me to defeat me." And I'll embarrass Rabbi Fox by saying I have many memories of Rabbi Moskowitz looking wistfully into the corner and saying, "You know, one of my greatest accomplishments was making Rabbi Fox." The Abravanel offers his own interpretation of Elisha's request. He explains that Pi Shnayim does not mean a double portion, but literally means two mouths. The Abravanel gives poignant expression to Elisha's thoughts, saying, "Until now, it was just the two of us alone together. We used to talk together all the time about matters of Torah, God, and Chachma. There was no one else but the two of us. But what am I to do? What am I going to do once you leave me?" This resonated deeply with me. And with permission of Rabbi Fox, I'm going to talk about how Rabbi Moskowitz impacted me. My relationship with Rabbi Moskowitz began when I came to NYHS in 11th grade. I had my first class with him right around the time I converted to Judaism. This learning relationship extended beyond school hours to classes he gave at his house on Sundays and during the summer. Those sessions were the highlights of my summers and exposed me to the type of relaxed, casual, banter-filled learning that epitomizes Rabbi Moskowitz's joyous approach to Torah. Equally good were the discussions we had afterwards for endless hours in the infinity of the Seattle summer afternoons. After the untimely passing of Shmuley, Alav Shalom, Rabbi Moskowitz gradually stopped giving public classes, but a handful of his Talmidim continued learning with him. Eventually, these group learning sessions stopped. Then it was just me and him alone together, sometimes in person and sometimes on the phone, sometimes every week and sometimes every day. It was during that transitionary period that I ceased viewing Rabbi Moskowitz as just my Rebbe. I realized that he had become one of my best friends. In that sense, I feel like Elisha must have felt. I just want to hang out with him again, talking about life and ideas and the life of ideas with my dear and irreplaceable friend, my Rebbe Haber. And the amazing thing is, I know that my experience wasn't unique. Rabbi Moskowitz cultivated so many individual relationships like this in each and every generation of his Talmidim and his friends and his colleagues. He had a gift for making each of us feel special. What exactly was Elisha asking for in his request for two mouths? The Abravanel explains, "Up until now, we spoke mouth to mouth, face to face. But from now on, let your spirit speak with me in prophecy, just like we used to do in person." I don't fully grasp what the Abravanel means, but I do know how it applies in the case of Rabbi Moskowitz. Not a day goes by that I don't quote Rabbi Moskowitz in my own shiurim. His voice is with me in the questions I ask, the answers I give, and in my relationship with my Talmidim. When I shared the Zoom info for this Levaya with my Tug meeting yesterday, I underscored this fact by borrowing a line from Rabbi Akiva and applying it to Rabbi Moskowitz. Shali v'shalachem shalohu. Your Torah and my Torah belong to him. And yes, I even have his literal voice with me on my phone. My favorite voicemail I saved from him, which begins with the words, "Hey Matt, this is your Yetzer Hara speaking." And let me tell you, if Rabbi Moskowitz is the voice of your Yetzer Hara, then that's a pretty big deal. It is impossible to fully express the magnitude of what we have lost. It is impossible to fully express my gratitude for what Rabbi Moskowitz has given me, along with all his other sons and daughters. All I can do is to cry out, Abi, Abi, Rechav Yisrael Parashav. On behalf of all of his children, I want to say thank you, Rebbe Umori Abi, for the lives you have given us. Thank you.
This time, Racheli Zimmer, daughter of Rabbi Bernie and Shirley Fox, student of Rabbi Moskowitz and friend of the family, will address us.
My three brothers join me in the sentiment that Rabbi and Mr. Moskowitz have always been like grandparents taught us. Together with the Weisses and the Owens, we were like one big family by choice. Rabbi Moskowitz went camping and hiking with us as kids. He was truly the light of the NYHS Shabbatonos that we all went on, or YOH, as Rabbi Moskowitz called it, far too many years post the name. I could not wait to be old enough to help Rabbi Moskowitz talk to the campus kitchen. Of course, there were those legendary stories of Rabbi Moskowitz breaking down in a 15-seater van with high school students in it, or what Rabbi Moskowitz might do to you if you didn't get up for minyan. By the time I went to high school, he had grown soft, and the worst we ever got was an eraser thrown at a head of a student. I recall that once I fell asleep in his class, and when the bell rang, I peeled my face away from my desk, and I heard other students joking, "Why did you throw a eraser at her? Why did you throw an eraser at her?" Nepotism, that's what saved me. What stands out for those lighthearted stories about our closeness with Moskowitz is something much deeper. Rabbi Moskowitz would teach about the Masorah, the tradition that keeps our religion alive, the unbroken generational chain which connects us back to God's revelation at Har Sinai. Well, we had a sort of Masorah in our family too. That was the vibrant Masorah of our Derech HaChaim. I didn't grow up with unfounded explanations for Jewish practices or flighty descriptions of Torah passages. Everything was thought about, analyzed, and carefully considered. And that approach extended beyond Torah learning. There was a strong precedent that our decisions and emotions should also be handled with a substantial degree of analytics and rational thought. And I always knew my parents didn't originate this style. The philosophy and ideas had materialized back in Homestead, Pennsylvania, where my parents' relationship with the Moskowitzes had begun. Rabbi Moskowitz had been my father's high school teacher, and I know on many Shabbats my father would trek from school held at Homestead to learn at Moskowitz's dining room table. They had the opportunity to develop further in Far Rockaway when my parents built their first home, and my father learned under Rabbi Chafe. Both as a child and now, nothing about what I was taught or the way I was raised felt like a guess. It was all calculated and deliberate. And now even more that I'm responsible for my own family, I can appreciate this. Personal unbroken chain of reason and thoughtfulness that I was privileged to experience. It was a robust legacy for which I am eternally grateful. When I married Aaron, Rabbi and Mrs. Moskowitz always made him feel completely at home. They immediately absorbed him into the family like they'd been there from the start. Really like loving grandparents, the Moskowitzes always took a sincere interest in our lives and offered their unconditional support and love. At our Pesach Seders, which I know Aaron remembers very fondly too, we'd enjoy the delicious Suda Mrs. Moskowitz prepared. Everyone with our own cushy swivel chair and personal salt and pepper shakers, and the conversation was always open and flowing, undulating between calm and rowdy, question, answer, then discussion. Of course, the Pesach Seder is meant to focus on the youth, but I tell you, the conversation was always this way in their home. It wasn't because it was the Pesach Seder. Rabbi and Mrs. Moskowitz firmly believed that a mind is a mind. It didn't matter how old. It's developing and growing. Extensive effort was always made to include even my young children, whether it meant meandering with them into something they had learned or explaining the purpose of many elements of the Moskowitz's home decor, anything to keep everyone occupied and involved, young and old. I conjure up this memory frequently. When things get tough with my own kids, when we disagree, I remember their minds are young and maturing. This is a journey. Stay the course. Growing up with Shmuley visiting from New York, I recall he had the same quality. Sure, he came over to learn with my father, but never without a pit stop to check in with us kids. He made the conversation relevant and interesting. He wanted to get to know us through our thinking and engage us intellectually. It's like they always say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Another memory Aaron and I will always cherish was the overwhelming privilege we had to host the Moskowitzes when we were in New York together last. When our son David was born. David was born on a Friday. I managed to convince the hospital to discharge me that same day. We made it home just in time for what was a very early winter Shabbos. Of course, an obvious reason to come home that soon was to rejoin with our other young children waiting at home. But to be honest, I think Aaron and I just could not bear the thought of missing out on what would be an epic Shabbos with our most honorable guests. The Moskowitzes ended up staying in New York through David's bris, and Rabbi Moskowitz had held David while he was being named. Last night, I found myself staring at that photo. When Rabbi Moskowitz started dialysis, we were all very frightened. It was no secret that although this treatment would prolong his life, it would be at the expense of his quality. I was immediately encouraged by something I recalled learning with Rabbi Moskowitz when he used to give summer shiur to students and alumni. It was a small crowd that particular day, the fans flowing and a reliable visit from Mrs. Moskowitz to see if anyone needed anything. Somehow we got to talking about sickness and death, but to be honest, this wasn't such a rare topic for Rabbi Moskowitz. He compelled us to consider something very uncomfortable for young people, all of us in our prime years physically. He proposed that the most important thing in this world is to develop the mind, because one's body is only physical, and when it fails, you'll still have your mind. If I recall correctly, he brought up my late Aunt Esther as an example. When her physical body slowly succumbed to multiple sclerosis, her mind kept going. And some of her boldest insights and wisdom came out of those dark years when she battled her debilitating illness the most. It was always my sincerest hope that during dialysis, Rabbi Moskowitz, like an ancient philosopher of the modern day, had his thoughts and learning to help him through the monotony of those treatments. I certainly took tremendous comfort in believing that that was the case. Like I mentioned, Rabbi Moskowitz didn't shy away from open discussion about death, the soul, and the afterlife. He'd ask us point blank, "Are you afraid of death?" Then he'd joke that we were probably just too young to have ever let the thought of death cross our minds. He confidently described that the value in having a finite number of years is that it helps the person refine himself and achieve closeness to Hashem. Because a person who knows he will die one day is more apt to make the most of his life and find its true meaning. If given unlimited years, people will just pursue hedonism and pleasure and never come to know their creator. Of course, if this discussion was presented by anyone else, it wouldn't have had nearly the impact. It was evident to everyone that Rabbi Moskowitz lived by this idea. His life's work was the study of Tehillim and Mishlei. Since the Torah is the best life, he fully dedicated himself to studying his handbooks to the exclusion of all other pursuits. In this sense, to me, losing Rabbi Moskowitz during these final days before Shavuot, while we await the receiving of the Torah, can be ascribed with some extra meaning. In the same way that at Matan Torah, we are privileged to face with our Creator and be granted our most precious gift, the Torah, Rabbi Moskowitz will finally have the chance to rejoin with the Kodesh Baruch Hu and experience the fulfillment of his soul in the Olam HaEmes. No doubt his last few years with Rabbi Moskowitz were not easy for him or anyone around him. Mrs. Moskowitz took care of him with a level of respect and admiration that I've never seen before. May she and all of us find comfort to hang Shmatot throughout its world of time.
The pallbearers will meet together at the cemetery, and the pallbearers are Rabbi Chaim Weiss, Rabbi Yonah Margulies, Rabbi Bernie Fox, Jeff Marion Cohen, Solomon Bezos, and Nissan Harel. I would ask everyone to please allow Mrs. Moskowitz to be the first one to get out to the cars. The timing is a little bit challenging now because of the Memorial Day holiday. We need to get to the cemetery, but Mrs. Moskowitz said I can't not speak. So I'd like to just condense things a little bit. Get a rabbi up here from the pulpit who condenses a speech. That's a miracle. The first thing that Rabbi Moskowitz and I learned together back in Pittsburgh 50 years ago, when you were a freshman, was Mishlei. And that impressed me tremendously, both Sarah and I, because also thank you, Leah, for inviting us. And I won't go through the whole story. You've heard it many times. U.S. Hashem Reishis Das, Chachma Musar Avilim Bazu. That was one that we really got stuck on at that time. And what Rabbi Moskowitz indicated is Chachma and Musar. What's the difference between the two? Wisdom and practical application of that. Says you need to, if you want to follow the Torah system, you want to be someone who's both a businessman as well as a theoretician. And we need a combination of both. And the person who's Musar Avilim, Chachma Musar Avilim Bazu, the people who are Avilim, it's interesting, it sounds like the word evil, but people who are foolish. And of course, Rabbi Moskowitz says the greatest evil, of course, is distorting the intellect and not living according to reality. So that's what a fool basically is. He came up with three basic approaches to why the Evil despises wisdom. So one approach is that the subject matter itself is rejected because the person can't accept authority. And so forget about the whole thing. I'm not going to do that if they're going to tell me what to do. The other is, I don't know it. So if I don't know it, it must not be important. If it were important, I would know it already. So that's the second approach that produces the Evil. And the third cause for the Evil is he knows that it's true. He knows or she knows that this is the way to go. But you know what? I'm not going to be that successful at it. So it's the sour grapes principle. If I really can't accomplish it, forget it. It's a waste of my time and I'm not going to do it. Rabbi Moskowitz, in my estimation, was the total opposite of that Evil. He was the person, as was illustrated by all the various stories that were presented so far, and there's many, many more that each of you can present, I'm sure. He was able to accept authority. His authority was the authority of wisdom, of Chachma. He also valued knowledge from whomever it came, from wherever it came. Who is wise, one who will learn from any person, from every person. And he emulated that and modeled that as well. And he knew what his limitations were. He knew that he wasn't quite, quote, perfect, but one didn't have to be in order to continue to develop, to grow, and to develop themselves. I think the greatest tribute that each one of us could make is to continue his legacy by continuing to follow the ideas that he's taught us and grow beyond it. Tehei b'shmaso, tzurura b'tzor v'chaim. Please rise. Al kanfei hashechino, B'malos kedoshim utahorim, kezohar horakia, mashirim, es nishmas, Rebbe Meir ben Ephraim Fischel, sheholach li'olamo, bavur shanachnu mispalim baraskos nishmaso, b'gan eden tehei menuchaso, l'chein ba'al harachamim, yasti rehu, b'seiser k'rafod li'olamim, v'yitzror v'yitzorachayim es nishmaso, Adonai hu nachaloso, v'yanuach b'sholem b'mishkavo, v'nomar amen. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant proper repose upon the sheltering wings of your presence, in the lofty levels of the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament. Unto the soul of Rabbi Meir ben Ephraim Fischel, who has gone to his eternal world, for whose memory we pray. May his repose be in Gan Eden. May the Master of Compassion bring him under the cover of God's wings and bind his soul in the bond of life. May Hashem be his heritage, and may he repose on his resting place in peace, b'shalom. And let us respond and say, Amen. And just a reminder, mask will also be requested when visiting Mrs. Moskowitz for the as well. And we'll see those of you who are going to the cemetery. Unless you have to go to the forest. What? Yes.
He's out of.